Hello and welcome to Memo's new weekly review, where we will discuss the key events in Palestine and the wider region from the past 7 days. My name is Nasim Ahmed, and joining me to unpack the events of the past week is Mouin Rabbani. Mouin is a Dutch Palestinian Middle East analyst specializing in the Israel-Palestine conflict and wider Palestinian affairs. He is a co-editor of Jadaliyya, a non-resident fellow at Center for Conflict and Humanitarian Studies. Mouin is also co-editor of the book Aborted State, the UN Initiative and New Palestinian Junctures. So today, the idea is to take a look at the key events in Gaza and on the diplomatic front, and also the wider impact of the war in Gaza. And I want to begin, more first, by welcoming you.
Thank you, Nasim. It's very good to be with you.
And by looking at Gaza itself, we know the death toll has risen to 25,000, and there is a imminent humanitarian catastrophe. The UN has raised the alarm on that front. But in terms of the military operation itself, Israel went in saying that its key war aim is the eradication of Hamas. But only last week, just a few days ago, the Palestinian group is saying that it's rebuilding its fighting capabilities in northern Gaza. So is Israel able to achieve its war aims? And to a lot of people, it seems like Hamas coming back into northern Gaza is a setback.
Yeah, I think that's a very pertinent question. It's not only Hamas that's making the assertion that it's rebuilding in northern Gaza. Israeli military analysts, US intelligence analysts are reaching the same conclusion, and they're pointing out that it's not only the Al-Qassam Brigades, the military wing of Hamas, that's reasserting itself in northern Gaza, but also, for example, its civil police. And I think the question that needs to be asked is whether the military presence of Hamas in the northern part of the Gaza Strip was ever eradicated in the first place. And I think the answer there is a clear no. The Israeli military is a very effective killing machine and is very proficient at dropping high explosives from advanced aircraft from thousands of feet up in the sky. But when it comes to the actual conduct of ground operations, of seizing and controlling territory, it's not, it's a fairly mediocre outfit. We saw this already in 2006 in southern Lebanon, and we're seeing it now again in the Gaza Strip, where Israel's adversaries are much weaker military forces than was Hezbollah. Yet this conflict is now, with the exception of the first Arab-Israeli War of 1948, 1949, is the longest Arab-Israeli war on record. And Israel is struggling. It has yet to take control of the Gaza Strip. The southern city of Rafah remains virtually untouched. The city of Khan Yunis, which Israel claims is the headquarters of the Hamas movement, fierce fighting day and night, no Israeli control. And the central camps, Maghazi, Brej, Nusayrat, there's still fighting going on there. And in the northern Gaza Strip, from where Israeli forces largely withdrew in recent weeks, claiming mission accomplished, well, Hamas is today releasing videos, as is Islamic Jihad, showing multiple attacks against those Israeli forces that remain there, taking control of drones and so on. And I think it's fair to say none of Israel's military objectives have been achieved. And I think we now need to ask ourselves whether any of those objectives can be achieved due to a combination of Israeli military incompetence and vulnerability on the one hand, a unwillingness by the Israeli military and the Israeli government to pay the costs in terms of human life and resources, Israeli lives and resources that it would take to achieve those objectives, and growing disarray within Israeli governing elites.
And we see the shift in goalpost and a recognition and awareness in Israel itself that the initial goal of eliminating Hamas is near impossible. I mean, it's something analysts like yourself and others have commented on previously. And an example of that is the storming of the Israeli Knesset by the families of hostages. It shows how domestically Netanyahu is running out of time. And just recently, Israel Channel 12 quoted a major general saying that Israel cannot achieve victory over Hamas in the Gaza Strip. And this general, his name is Yitzhak Brick, I think he's part of the reserve force. He went on to say or stress that the only available option for Israel is to accept a prisoner exchange deal, whose terms were set by the Hamas leader, Yahya Sinwar, head of the Hamas in the Gaza Strip. So that shows time is definitely running out for Netanyahu, and the war efforts are not achievable. And I remember 2008-9 war, 2012, 2014, every single war Israel went in saying that we are seeking the eradication of Hamas. And every single one of those previous operation, Israel failed to eradicate Hamas.
Well, I would make several points. I don't think that in previous Israeli assaults on the Gaza Strip, Israel had the destruction of Hamas as a strategic objective. It pursued a strategy that rather obscenely it referred to as mowing the lawn, keeping Hamas weak, keeping the Gaza Strip on edge, and so on. But it didn't actually seek the overthrow of Hamas in the Gaza Strip. This time, as you know, is different. This time, the eradication of Hamas has been an Israeli objective from the very first day, both in terms of Hamas as a military force and as a government. This general you referred to, Brick, I don't know if he's retired or reservist, he has actually been skeptical of Israeli ambitions from the get-go, from the very beginning. He said, and apparently also met with Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu to convey the message, that Hamas cannot be eradicated. And if Israel insists on pursuing this objective, it's basically engaging in a fool's errand. And in relation to the war objectives, many people have noted from the outset that Israel is pursuing two contradictory objectives. On the one hand, a military campaign to eradicate Hamas, and on the other, seeking the safe return of all captives and hostages that are being held in the Gaza Strip. The way that the Israeli government, for example, Defense Minister Yoav Gallant, has sought to present this is that it is the military campaign and the military pressure on Hamas that will force the movement to release the captives that it holds. Well, the reality has turned out to be very different, which is namely that Hamas, from before the ground operation, offered to enter into a prisoner exchange. Israel was not interested in a prisoner exchange and therefore launched a ground operation. And then the only time that it was actually able to achieve the retrieval of live captives was during the temporary ceasefire that was achieved during the last week of November. And I think here we also need to look at it in broader perspective, which is that releasing the captives was very much a secondary Israeli objective. If you look at their statements during the first week, it was all very much about pulverizing the Gaza Strip, pulverizing Hamas, eradicating the movement, disarming the Gaza Strip, and so on. And it was really only due to a combination of public pressure from the families and friends of the Israeli captives and other sectors of Israeli society on the one hand, and pressure from foreign states whose citizens were among the captives, that became an increasingly prominent objective. And I think what this General Brick is pointing out is you can't have it both ways. You can either pursue a military campaign to seek to eradicate Hamas, or you can engage in negotiations with Hamas to seek the release of the captives, but you can't do both simultaneously because they work at cross purposes.
Now, that contradiction was quite widely commented on right at the beginning, that what Israel was doing in Gaza was not a rescue operation, hostage rescue operation. It was more, as we know clearly, more a genocidal operation. And that is why the South African team have issued an ICJ or lodged an ICJ complaint. But what provides further proof of what you're saying is what's happened just recently again. Senior Biden advisor Brett McGurk, he's expected to travel to Egypt and Qatar this week for talks to advance negotiations to secure the release of hostages. So that again further confirms that the US itself is putting the hostages above the eradication of Hamas. And Hamas, right from the beginning, as we know, has said that that the only way hostages will be released is if there is a permanent ceasefire. So that is another indication that the US has conceded defeat in some way in trying to eradicate the Palestinian group.
Well, Hamas's position has actually been that they will not engage in any discussions or negotiations about an additional exchange of captives until there is a permanent ceasefire. It now appears to be the case that there are various ideas being floated around by the Qatari and Egyptian mediators that at least are forming the basis for a discussion, but Hamas appears to be holding fast to its position that it will not negotiate the details of any prisoner exchange in the absence of a ceasefire. And I think one only needs to look at what happened in late November with that previous temporary ceasefire to understand why this is the case. Israel, the US advocated and Israel accepted a temporary ceasefire. The US informed the Israelis that it was important for Israel to accept this temporary ceasefire because that would make it easier for the United States to continue defending Israel's genocidal onslaught on the Gaza Strip. The Israelis accepted this, again, by stating that in doing so, it would become easier for them to justify the continuation of their war. And what we saw after that truce expired on the 1st of December was not only a continuation of the Israeli onslaught, but in fact, an intensification of it. And this is something that Hamas is not willing to accept because it amounts to a stay of execution, a Khmer Rouge coffee break, if you will. And therefore, they're insisting on a permanent ceasefire, and only on that basis will they engage in further negotiations on an exchange of captives.
So let's move back a bit and focus on the escalation in the region.
Can I just add something to that point?
Yeah, sure.
And I think, getting back to your question, I think the Americans are coming around to this view. I think they would be quite happy for Israel to achieve its war objectives. In fact, they're unconditionally supporting them and would be quite happy to see Israel retrieve the captives through military pressure. But they're looking at reality. They are seeing Israeli failure. And given that Israeli failure, which the US also believes reflects poorly on Washington's regional and geopolitical position, they appear to now be engaging seriously and looking at other formulas involving a cessation of hostilities in order to engage in further releases of captives. And in fact, some Israeli analysts have also indicated that there's a growing realization within senior ranks of the Israeli leadership that this war has failed, and not only has it failed, but will be unable to achieve its objectives, and that renewed negotiations for an exchange of captives will be the face-saving formula that will allow Israel to wind down its operations.
Let's wait and see what senior US official is able to do with regards to the hostage issue next week. I'm sure we'll return to this topic again. And now turn our attention to the region itself. We've seen escalation of the conflict in the Red Sea. Biden, of course, pledged right at the beginning he does not wish to see the conflict escalate in the way it has. But Washington, according to latest reports, is drawing up plans for sustained military action against the Houthis, the Yemeni group. So are we seeing the US entangling itself in yet another open-ended Middle Eastern conflict without a clear exit strategy? Without a clear exit strategy, because as we know, bombing the Houthis has not worked. Saudis have tried for many, many years and it failed. And we don't really know what the aim of this operation is. So are we seeing the US entangling itself in yet another open-ended conflict?
That may very well prove to be the case. As you pointed out, Yemen has been subject to an 8-year war by a Saudi-led coalition. And some people are suggesting, well, the Saudis aren't very sophisticated. Leave it to the Americans and the Brits. They'll be able to handle the Ansar Allah. Well, first of all, the Saudis have been flying advanced U.S. fighter jets using advanced U.S. weaponry by way of highly trained and competent Saudi pilots, hitting targets that have, in many cases, been identified for them by U.S. intelligence. And 8 years after the war began, Ansar Allah, the Houthis, have emerged not weakened, but strengthened. And so on that basis, particularly given that unlike Saudi Arabia or the United Arab Emirates, there's no indication that the US or the UK are prepared to commit ground forces to Yemen. I see no reason to accept the premise that the US
You've cut off Mouin.
Demonstrates several other factors. First of all, whether you're talking about Ansar Allah in Lebanon, Ansar Allah in Yemen, Hezbollah in Lebanon, various militias in Iraq or others, they have all made clear from the very outset that the only rationale for their attacks, whether against Israel or against Israeli shipping in the Red Sea, or against US military sites in Iraq and Syria, is to end Israel's genocidal onslaught on the Gaza Strip and end the Israeli siege of the Gaza Strip. In other words, if the US, instead of sending its bombers over Yemen, would exercise the leverage it undoubtedly has and make that phone call to Netanyahu and say, enough is enough, now you stop, all these other things would stop. Instead, the US appears to have decided that attacking Yemen is preferable, and I should point out the most catastrophic humanitarian situation in the Middle East, if not the world, prior to the beginning of Israel's onslaught in the Gaza Strip, was in Yemen. If instead of attacking Yemen, the Americans would use their influence with Israel to end its genocidal onslaught in the Gaza Strip, all these things would be instantaneously resolved. But here again, you have a situation where Washington and London are appear to believe that maintaining open shipping lanes through the Arabian Sea, Bab el-Mandeb, the Red Sea, and the Suez Canal, that is of significantly more importance than ending the genocide in the Gaza Strip.
Yeah, and we've seen a real disingenuous attempt to try and present this military air assault in Yemen as though it's got nothing to do with Gaza. British officials, British ministers have come out, comically, I should say, that this has nothing to do with Gaza. It's a terrorist organization flexing its muscle. Of course, no one believes that.
But if I may, I mean, what could they say? They can either tell these fibs that you've just enumerated, or they could tell the truth, which doesn't make them look very well, which is that only Israel, as far as we're concerned, is entitled to have international allies and those supporting it militarily. We are attacking Yemen to ensure that Israel can continue with its genocidal onslaught on the Gaza Strip unchallenged and unmolested by anyone coming out in support of the Palestinians. Well, that's that's obviously not a very good look, and I think explains why they're engaging in these rather delusional statements that what's happening elsewhere in the region has absolutely nothing to do with the Gaza Strip.
Yeah, and long-term credibility that the UK and the US is losing as a result of this. I think it's unprecedented, but we'll wait and see how that develops. But big story from from a couple of days ago is Netanyahu coming out openly stating that he will never allow the creation of a Palestinian state.
I told President Biden, he says, Gaza must be demilitarized under Israel's full security control. I will not compromise on full Israeli security control of all territory west of the Jordan River.
Of course, that's important because the West and the Middle Eastern countries, in particular Saudi Arabia, who is seeking to normalize ties with Israel, have said that the only solution is the two-state solution. Now here, Netanyahu is humiliating his US allies, humiliating his Western allies as well, by saying, no, there will never be a two-state solution. What do you make of that? For someone like yourself who's been following this for many, many years, we would have thought two-state solution is a dead horse, and it's not something that's even sustainable. But what do you make of the shock of the Western allies, and where does it put them when Netanyahu comes out so openly and brazenly saying that there will never be a Palestinian state?
I'm still trying to understand why this is even a newsworthy item. Netanyahu has consistently throughout his political career rejected Palestinian self-determination and Palestinian statehood. It's arguably a primary reason for his rise to power. And in fact, his initial position used to be that Jordan should be a Palestinian state. After the Jordanian-Israeli peace treaty, he changed his tune. But he has never come out in support of Palestinian statehood, and he has consistently opposed it. I mean, with one exception, when under pressure from the Obama administration, he made a statement only in English, not in Hebrew, which could be interpreted as him conditionally endorsing a Palestinian entity under certain conditions. But so anyone who knows anything about Netanyahu should have expected exactly what he said. Now, regarding the question of why he sticks his thumb in Biden's eye, in the EU's eye, and so on, the simple answer is because he knows that he can. Netanyahu understands that he can oppose the policy preferences of his sponsors and of his closest allies, and do so at will, because there will never be consequences. There have never been consequences placed upon Israel by its Western sponsors and allies for Israel's opposition to stated Western policy preferences. Sure, they don't like what he's doing, perhaps. They might even publicly oppose what he's doing. But at the end of the day, they will not challenge him. They will not confront him, and they will never impose consequences. And this will be no different. And Netanyahu understands that. But I think there's one more point, which is that, while there's an ongoing genocidal campaign being waged by Israel in the Gaza Strip, while there is intensified ethnic cleansing in the West Bank, and unprecedented levels of violence by Israel's military and settlers, pogroms and so on in the West Bank. And while there is growing escalation in Yemen and elsewhere in the region, with the real prospect of a full-scale regional war, while all this is happening, to start talking about a two-state settlement is really nothing more than a diversionary charade. The idea of ignoring what's going on in Gaza, ignoring the US's own complicity and Europe's own complicity in it, and thinking that the discussion should somehow be shifted to an aspirational political resolution, which is at best years down the line, is entirely meaningless and a charade and a deliberate diversion. More than that, quite apart from the question of whether or not a two-state settlement can be implemented in practice, you can't have a two-state settlement without ending the occupation. And the record is clear. Since 1967, neither the United States nor the Europeans have ever challenged Israel's continuation and deepening of the occupation. In fact, they have enabled it, and they have never imposed consequences on Israel for its indefinite and deepening occupation and annexationist practices. If anything, their policies, their acts of omission and commission have made the occupation and the settlement enterprise in particular a viable enterprise by, for example, allowing illegal settlement products to flood their markets and so on.
Yeah, which makes the statement by the EU's top diplomat, Joseph Borrell, even more strange. He came out and said that in response to Netanyahu's comment that the two-state solution should be imposed from outside. Based on what you're saying and based on what we know, that US and Europe have never managed to impose anything on Israel. Israel has enjoyed impunity since its existence. Another disingenuous thing that I see, which maybe you can comment on, is how the Western UK, Europe, and America in general, they're trying to pin the problem on Netanyahu, as though Netanyahu is the big problem here. I don't think that they're willing to accept the fact that Israel itself, it's not just Netanyahu, Israel itself will never permit a Palestinian state and end its occupation. That's the bigger issue. It's not just Netanyahu. That's something, the idea that Palestinians should never have a state was something supported from Israeli society all the way to the top. There's a reason why Netanyahu has won as many elections as he has. He's the most successful Israeli prime minister. He's the longest serving Israeli prime minister. And that should say something. The problem isn't Netanyahu. The problem is much deeper than Netanyahu.
Yes, I mean, during the Trump administration in the United States, some commentators began to speak about a phenomenon that they labeled Trump derangement syndrome, which was a way of pinning everything that is wrong in US governance, US society, US foreign policy on one individual, Donald Trump. Remove Trump and everything will be peaches and cream. And now I think we have something similar with respect to Israel, Netanyahu derangement syndrome, seeking to pretend that the problem is not, as you pointed out, an Israeli consensus, Israeli principles with respect to their dealings with the Palestinian people, but rather one individual. And if only we can remove him from the equation, everything will go smoothly back on the rails. Well, of course not. And if you look, for example, at the current war, um, a lot of commentators have suggested that the reason that this genocidal onslaught continues is because Netanyahu has a personal interest in its continuation, and that the moment the war ends, he will be removed from office and carted off to prison on various corruption charges. Well, that may or may not be true, but I find it very difficult to believe that Israel's security establishment, Israel's ruling elites, Netanyahu's coalition partners, even all the different power centers in Netanyahu's own Likud party, are somehow not convinced that this war should continue, but are going along with it simply to keep one individual out of prison. It defies logic and imagination. And furthermore, who, in my view, has the most interest in prosecuting this war? I don't think it's Netanyahu, even given the motivations that he certainly does have. It's the military establishment. It's the generals. It's the leaders of the Israeli military and intelligence services that are responsible for the historic, unprecedented, catastrophic failure on October 7th, seeking to reclaim at least some honor through the genocidal pulverization of the Gaza Strip. And we've seen numerous statements from this sector of Israeli society insisting that the war continue until some results are achieved. So I completely agree with you. Trying to personalize this entire issue, trying to personalize the failure to resolve the question of Palestine as if it's as if it can all be summarized in two words, Benjamin and Netanyahu, is, I think, way off the mark.
One final development I want to get your thoughts on is the ICC and the ICJ. 2 days ago, the government of Mexico and Chile filed a joint request to the prosecutor of the ICC, Karim Khan, against Israeli war crimes. And in the UK, the Met Police have issued a statement calling on people to come forward with evidence of Israeli war crimes and crimes against humanity in Gaza and Palestine in general. So we are now seeing two high legal cases, high profile legal cases from the ICC and the ICJ. And I think their reputation is at stake. What I want to ask you is Israel and its European allies worried, and how quickly this legal campaign has taken off? I don't think just a month ago people would have expected the legal campaigns to take off in the way it has. Now we have Mexico, we have Chile, many other countries. There's a grassroots movement across the world to see Israel indicted in the ICJ and of course ICC. So do you think European allies are worried silently about the momentum of this legal campaign?
I think they are, particularly about the International Court of Justice, which is one of the principal UN organs and is something that all UN member states, including the Europeans, have repeatedly voiced their support of. And now all of a sudden they have to choose, do you support the international system or do you support Israel? And given that for Western states, the United States and the European Union, Israeli impunity is, as far as they are concerned, the foundational principle of international law and needs to be inscribed into the rules-based international system that they have constructed. You've seen governments like Germany, basically saying to hell with international law, to hell with the International Court of Justice, Israel über alles, and that they will not accept Israel being held to any standard whatsoever. But having said that, South Africa, which I think can legitimately claim to be the leader of the free world in this case and the moral conscience of the world, has submitted this case to the ICJ. this has already done, I think, unprecedented and irreversible reputational damage to Israel. And Israel will, until the end of its days, be forever tainted by the charge of genocide, which in Israel's case, for obvious reasons, is a huge deal. And I think this is going to be the case irrespective of how the ICJ ends up issuing its final judgment several years down the line. And it has also, I think, exposed the extraordinary hypocrisy of the West, where thus far, if I'm not mistaken, only Belgium has made the obvious statement that international law needs to be respected and that it's for the ICJ to decide this case on its merits. So that's number one. And the reason I said reputational damage is because the International Court of Justice does not have any mechanisms to enforce its own judgments. The only mechanism available to the International Court of Justice is the United Nations Security Council. Well, that's where the United States has a power of veto. And that means, again, that a foundational principle of international law is that no judgment against Israel will ever be enforced, thanks to the efforts of Washington. I think the International Criminal Court, which deals with individual criminal responsibility rather than the adjudication of disputes within states, is a different kettle of fish. The ICC was being already denounced as, the International Caucasian Court, the International Criminal Court for Africa, and so on. And it was already dealing with a very significant legitimacy deficit when the current prosecutor, Karim Khan of the United Kingdom, assumed office in 2021. And he seems to have it as his mission to shred whatever legitimacy and credibility the ICC has left by applying such brazen double standards in his dealings, for example, with the situation in Ukraine on the one hand and the situation in Palestine on the other. I don't want to get into too many details, but upon assuming office, Khan made clear that he would prioritize only those cases referred to his office by the UN Security Council, which was really his way of saying that he would no longer pursue the ongoing ICC investigations into the situations in Palestine and Afghanistan. Well, as soon as Russia invaded Ukraine the following year, he immediately reversed course and within a year issued an arrest warrant for the head of state of a permanent member of the UN Security Council, while at the same time having virtually nothing to say on the situation of Palestine, except to repeatedly condemn Palestinian atrocities in Israel on October 7th. And he's been entirely mute throughout this entire throughout the entire proceedings on genocide at the International Court of Justice. So again, I suspect that Khan will hide behind one of the ICC principles, which is that the court will only prosecute cases where national courts fail or refuse to do so. And he is already on record praising the Israeli judicial system, which has been denounced and found to be a whitewashing apparatus by any human rights organization who has looked at how it deals with war crimes and crimes against humanity by Israel in the occupied territories.
And we'll certainly be keeping an eye on that and providing further analysis as things progress. I want to thank you, Mouin, for joining us for this review show, and hope to have you again on next week for our weekly memo review show. And thank you all for tuning in, and see you again for another memo review of Palestine and the Middle East. See you soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much, Nasim. It was a pleasure being on the program.